T-Tube. News today, March 6, 2022. T-Tube is the voice for the voiceless. Follow, subscribe and share. We need your comments for the betterment of our programs. Today's programs, headlines.
The butcher Abiy Ahmed Ali is bombing Tigray cities while he is kidding the international communities for negotiation.
Nowhere to run, Eritrean refugees in Tigray. Refugees International. March 3, 2022. War in Tigray takes a toll on children. Medical professionals who spoke with Deutsche Welle, DW, reporter in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray state, say the war in Tigray has taken a toll on children.
New report highlights Tigray atrocities, says Ethiopia could face famine. National Catholic reporter. Abiy Ahmed Ali's lies are becoming the business of comedians. Comedians are documenting and entertaining people with the Abiy's lies. Comedian Eshetu is a prominent example.
ጦርነት አለ ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ?
አሁን በኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ምንም አይነት ጦርነት የለም። ሀገሪቱ ፍጹም ሰላም ነች።
ያሁን ኢትዮጵያ ምን አይነት ስሜት ላይ ነች ብለህ ታስባለህ?
የደስታ የብልጽግና የፌሽታ ስሜት ውስጥ ነው ያለችው። ከባድ
The butcher Abiy Ahmed Ali is bombing Tigray cities while he is kidding the international communities as if he is ready for negotiation. Yesterday, Abiy Ahmed Ali bombed 2 Tigray cities after he lied the world, as if he is ready for peace and negotiation in the statement of Russian-Ukrainian war peace wishes. The butcher Abiy Ahmed Ali has been buying armaments from Russia and Ukraine in the past 16 months to commit Tigray genocide. Now, both his allied countries are in a bloody war with each other, although his party and the Amhara shifter and the butcher Eritrean dictator are expressing their support with Russia. Abiy Ahmed is wishing peace to both his allied powers, not to disappoint one of them while he is bombing his own country, killing children and raping women. Abiy's country is also in a huge crisis and famine in Somali, Afar, Amhara, Tigray, Oromia and all regional states. In the past 4 years of power, any strategic plan has planned, neither the previous public advantages have been achieved. Abiy only destroyed the previous assets of the country in collaboration with the country's distinguished enemies. Abiy has been in a honeymoon for almost 3 years and in war for the rest. Now, life is untouchable, inflation is 300% and above in the capital city and worse in the regional states. More than half of the country's territory is under foreign invaders while he is singing on territorial integrity and sovereignty. The total population, including his supporters, are now turned to his enemy. Now, Abiy Ahmed's lies or the income of comedians. So many comedians in and outside the country are documenting his lies. Abiy is the father of lie. Even he holds fake PhD using his skills of lies. Abiy, the enemy of his own country, is selling the assets of the country, including the Ethio-Djibouti Railway, Ethio Telecom, the Grand Reminiscence Dam, Ethiopian Airlines, Ethiopian Electric Corporation and any other state-owned properties to buy armors and armaments to extend genocide on his own country. Although the people is aware now, there is no freedom to speak, neither is freedom to oppose. Abiy is known for dramatizing assassins. He assassinated Amhara leaders, Tigray generals, and Oromo singer Hachalu Hundessa simply to extend his power. Abiy is also known for arresting millions of Tigrayans simply for their identity. Abiy is the cruel man of 21st century who is committing genocide and licensed for that by the Nobel Peace Prize when he was preparing for genocide.
Nowhere to run, Eritrean refugees in Tigray. Refugees International. March 3, 2022. The humanitarian situation in Ethiopia's northern region of Tigray is nothing short of abysmal. Atrocities amounting to war crimes have led to the forced displacement of nearly 2.5 million people inside Ethiopia and into neighboring states. The Ethiopian government has blocked virtually all food and medical shipments into Tigray, using food as a weapon of war. With starvation deaths mounting each day and as many as 900,000 people in famine conditions, there are fears that the current situation in Ethiopia will mirror the Great Famine of the 1980s, where over 1 million people starved to death. Humanitarian actors, desperate to deliver life-saving aid, are unable to access those most in need. Ethiopian authorities are enforcing a communications blackout, and Ethiopian soldiers and Eritrean invading troops are targeting aid workers. Across 3 regions in Ethiopia, the UN now estimates some 9 million people need food assistance. The entire population of Tigray and many parts of neighboring Amhara and Afar are suffering greatly. Among these, one vulnerable group is getting lost. Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia have received little attention or assistance despite facing unique risks. They fled one of the worst human rights situations in the world and are now being targeted, killed, kidnapped, tortured, subjected to discrimination, and otherwise abused in Ethiopia. Like Tigrayans, Eritrean refugees are also suffering from the food and medicine blockade. Neither the Ethiopian state nor the Eritrean invaders, or the Amhara invaders and Shifta are protecting Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. The UN has been unable to guarantee their safety. Indeed, in early 2021, Eritrean troops destroyed 2 Eritrean refugee camps in Tigray, dispersing approximately 20,000 Eritrean refugees. In January 2022, refugees were killed by airstrikes that hit refugee camps. The UN and other aid actors have routinely been unable to reach the camps for weeks or even months at a time. Put simply, Ethiopia is no longer a safe country for Eritrean refugees, neither it is for Tigrayans. Broadly speaking, all parties to the conflict need to participate in an inclusive peace process, and the humanitarian blockade of Tigray must be lifted immediately. Neighboring states, the African Union, financing institutions like the World Bank, and other states, including the United States, Turkey, China, and the United Arab Emirates, must push for an immediate ceasefire, full aid access, peace talks, and the respect of human rights for all inside Ethiopia. Fighting groups should never target civilians, including refugees and internally displaced people (IDPs). However, the Bicha Abiy Ahmed is putting the refugees to wearing zones so as to make them as defense mechanisms and use them as accusing TDF. This crueler act is strictly inhuman. Abiy is also bombing them with drones. Specific to Eritrean refugees, pressure must be brought to bear on Ethiopia to meet its obligation to protect refugees on its territory. Ethiopia should demand that Eritrean troops withdraw from the conflict and not have contact with or attack Eritrean refugees, and the Human Rights Council should investigate human rights abuses and kidnappings of refugees by Eritrean troops and other armed groups. Ethiopia is aimed to perish Eritreans to control the Red Sea base. Tigray genocide is clearly planned to control Red Sea base. To control it, the Amhara had to perish Tigranya-speaking population. For its part, the UN Refugee Agency (UNHCR) should reconsider moving refugees to newly erected camps within easy reach of active conflict zones, instead focusing its efforts on helping Eritrean refugees find areas of refuge that provide greater safety, as well as durable solutions to their displacement. Indeed, it should work with donor states like the United States to offer resettlement as quickly as possible to those Eritrean refugees who are of greatest vulnerability and who may be interested in resettlement options. For Eritrean refugees who wish to stay in Ethiopia, UNHCR and Ethiopia should work with all relevant stakeholders to provide safe passage out of conflict zones to other parts of the country, including Addis Ababa. The UN should also work with neighboring states like Sudan and Kenya to prepare to welcome Eritrean refugees trying to leave Ethiopia and unable to find refuge elsewhere. The tragedy in Ethiopia, and the famine in Tigray in particular, over the last year was described by the UN's Martin Griffiths as a stain on our conscience. Overlooking the needs of some of the most vulnerable caught up in the crisis must not add insult to injury, especially as it is clear that Ethiopia is no longer an adequate refuge for those fleeing Eritrea. Context overview of the conflict and humanitarian situation in November 2020. Rising tensions between Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy and Tigrayan regional leadership culminated in an attack by Abiy Ahmed Ali, Eritrea and allied powers on Tigrayan forces on and Tigray state, which leads to complete invasion and destruction of Tigray and Tigrayans, which amounted to genocide and crimes against humanity. Prime Minister Abiy responded with a military offensive on Tigray, and fighting quickly spiraled to include Tigray's armed forces, the Ethiopian army, Amharan militia, and Eritrean forces. The fighting remained largely in Tigray, and was accompanied by massacres, torture, kidnapping, widespread rape as a weapon, and the destruction of medical facilities and infrastructure. Banking and telecommunications were blocked, farms destroyed, livestock slaughtered, and a range of other human rights violations occurred over the next 8 months. In addition, widespread looting continues to prevent people from receiving desperately needed food and medicine, and a mix of indiscriminate attacks and targeted violence by all parties has led to the deaths of some 25 aid workers over the last year. In June of 2021, Tigrayan forces recaptured much of Tigray, and then pressed into Amhara and toward Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Toward the end of 2021, Ethiopia regained territory with the help of drones from other states, including Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran. Tigrayan forces, perhaps responding to international pressure or in order to regroup, abruptly returned to Tigray and called for immediate humanitarian access. To date, the fighting continues, and Ethiopian forces continue to block access to those in need. The World Food Programme recently reported that its operations would grind to a halt as fuel, funding, and stock are running out. They also report a record 9.4 million people in need of humanitarian food assistance in Ethiopia. Starvation deaths are now being reported, with somewhere between 425 and 1,201 people dying of hunger each day. Some non-governmental organizations (NGOs) report that the population, children in particular, are too malnourished to receive vaccines. Other reports depict displaced people eating leaves to survive. And a recent UN report noted an all-time low for food distribution in Tigray. Supply stock, including therapeutic nutrition supplies to treat severe acute malnutrition, and fuel have almost entirely been depleted. Thus far, international actors have been unable to stop the conflict or convince the government of Ethiopia to lift the blockade. For their parts, United Nations and African Union peacemaking efforts have gained little traction, and the United States, EU, and other donor states continue to push for peace talks. Other influential states, like China, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates, may also have opportunities to push Ethiopia to end the conflict. Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. Eritrean refugees are among the vulnerable populations affected by the atrocities. Isayas has been killing the people of Eritrea for 30 years at home, and now he is assassinating them in neighboring Tigray refugees camps. Displacement, and deteriorating humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia. Hundreds of thousands of Eritreans have sought refuge in Ethiopia in recent decades, and the country currently has some 149,000 Eritrean refugees. They have fled some of the worst human rights conditions in the world. For example, Eritrea ranks even lower than North Korea in the World Press Freedom Index of 2021. Freedom of worship, widespread persecution, forced military conscription, and other widespread rights violations are common. Those who speak out or are even suspected of opposition to government policy have been jailed for years, tortured, executed, and disappeared.
Eritreans who have fled to Ethiopia face similar challenges to refugees from other countries, like South Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen. Ethiopia hosts 800,000 refugees, one of the largest refugee populations in the world. Most refugees are required to live in the camps, which are jointly run by the UN Refugee Agency (UNHCR) and Ethiopia's Refugee and Returnees Services (RSS), formerly known as ARA, or the Agency for Refugee and Returnee Affairs. Until 2020, very few refugees had the legal right to work. Before the war, many Eritreans in Ethiopia would migrate to Sudan, and some would travel onward with hopes of reaching Europe via Libya and across the Mediterranean Sea. On these routes, many have been trafficked, tortured, and/or sold into slavery. Of those who remained in Ethiopia, most resided in Tigray, largely due to geography. Tigray borders Eritrea, and cultural and linguistic similarities, although they have been divided by the Amhara Krulaman Manilook II. Nearly all Eritrean refugees in Tigray were clustered in 4 camps: Hitsats, Shemelba, Maiini, and Adi Harush. The needs of Eritreans still inside Tigray and Amhara nowhere to run. Since the start of the conflict, both Eritrean forces, ENDF, the Amhara Shifter and Fano, the Somalian invading troops have targeted Eritrean refugees, the former targeting Eritrean refugees as vengeance for having fled their native country, in many cases to avoid conscription, and the latter as vengeance for the atrocities Eritrean forces have committed against Tigrayans. As Human Rights Watch's Letitia Bada indicates, Eritrean refugees have been attacked both by the very forces they fled back home and by the Amhara fighters. The horrific killings, rapes, and looting against Eritrean refugees in Tigray are evident war crimes. And they have been targeted by those wanting to attack Tigrayans, as many speak Tigrania and may easily be mistaken for Tigrayan Ethiopians. Abiy Ahmed and Isayas Afewerki used them to spear the hate between the two brother people, as the expansion of the hate spread by Menelik II. Some of the fiercest attacks have been carried out by Eritrean troops who crossed into Ethiopia to join the fight. In January 2021, satellite images revealed that Eritrean troops had destroyed the 2 northern Eritrean camps of Hitsats and Shemelba. These camps were home to approximately 20,000 Eritrean refugees. It was difficult to confirm the state of these camps for weeks and even months, as telecommunications were cut in Tigray, misinformation was common, and the conflict was raging.
The UN was finally able to gain access in March 2021, and confirmed that the camps were completely destroyed, with all occupants scattered, and all humanitarian facilities looted and vandalized. Human Rights Watch reported that these camps were directly targeted by belligerent Eritrean and Tigrayan forces, who occupied the camps and committed abuses. Most residents are believed to have fled, but some Eritrean refugees were killed, and many more, potentially thousands, were kidnapped back into Eritrea. Cross-border attacks on camps are not unheard of in many refugee situations, particularly along porous borders with tense security situations and ongoing conflict. However, the wholesale destruction of camps and the large-scale kidnapping from a country of asylum back into the country of origin is quite rare, and certainly cause for alarm. Indeed, Eritrea has taken advantage of the conflict in Ethiopia to settle old scores, and Ethiopia has permitted it. A recent Reuters report describes one kidnapping instance where soldiers detained a group of refugee leaders, pinning their elbows behind their backs and holding them for days in a church. They were then taken away in trucks and have not been heard from since. Multiple displacements, unsafe encampment, lack of assistance and protection since the destruction of the northern camps of Hitsats and Shemelba that displaced 20,000 Eritrean refugees early in the conflict, and attacks on Eritrean refugees and the civilian population elsewhere in Tigray. Thousands more Eritrean refugees have been repeatedly displaced. Some have moved multiple times in Tigray. Others have sought safety in Addis Ababa. In one instance in December 2020, Eritrean refugees who had reached Addis Ababa were forcibly escorted back to Tigray. To date, aid groups are unclear of what has happened to many of the 20,000 Eritrean refugees who left Hitsats and Shemelba. Some Eritrean refugees managed to reach other camps. Approximately 5,000 made their way to Maiini and Adi Harush camps as of February 2021. However, their situation in these camps remains precarious. Since June 2021, UNHCR and other aid agencies have routinely been cut off from these camps, blocked from delivering food, medicine, and other assistance for weeks or even months at a time. In January 2022, UNHCR issued a statement indicating that its staff had been unable to reach Mai Aini or Adi Harush for 3 weeks. When UN staff finally reached the camps, they found refugees scared and struggling to get enough to eat, lacking medicine and with little or no access to clean water. They highlighted more than 20 preventable deaths due to the lack of medicine and health services.
Attacks have also targeted refugees in the camps. Some faced vengeance attacks by Amhara. In a recent airstrike by Ethiopian force, 3 refugees in Mayani, 2 of whom were children, were killed. Even last July, UNHCR raised the alarm about the safety of Eritreans in camps in Tigray, citing concern that 24,000 Eritrean refugees in Mayani and Adi Harush faced intimidation, harassment and were cut off from assistance. And in February 2022, thousands of Eritrean refugees fled Barili camp in Afar region after the camp was attacked and refugees killed and kidnapped by the ENDF and Eritrean troops. Despite these dangers, UNHCR is working with the Ethiopian government to build new shelter and camps for Eritrean refugees near Dabat and Alemwich in the Amhara region. Some refugees approve of this relocation, if only because they are desperate to get out of harm's way. However, many others do not feel they will be safe anywhere in Ethiopia, let alone in these camps. Eritrean refugees are commonly mistaken for or associated with Tigrayans, who face threats and discrimination across Ethiopia. And deliberately, Isayas in collaboration with Abiy Ahmed is kidnapping refugees from Addis Ababa. Or they are associated by vengeful Tigrayans with Eritrean soldiers, who have been implicated in massacres, mass rape, and other abuses in Tigray. Host Tigrayan communities that had lived peacefully with Eritrean refugees for years now fear that Eritrean refugees cannot be trusted. The needs of Eritreans in Sudan. While most Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia are believed to have remained in the country since the violence began in November 2020, some have fled to Sudan, joining a larger, older caseload of Eritrean refugees there. The newly arrived Eritrean refugees are among some 55,000 Ethiopian refugees who made their way into Sudan in the early months of the conflict. Over 2021, the border between Ethiopia and Sudan became increasingly difficult and dangerous to cross, and rising tensions stemming from long-standing grievances between Ethiopia and Sudan make it dangerous for refugees to flee to safety. In addition, Sudan's coup in October 2021 and its aftermath have added financial and political strains, with potential impacts on its overall capacity to assist refugees. In the early months of the conflict, Sudan received praise for its relative openness despite already hosting a protracted refugee population of some 1 million people from various countries in the region. However, by June 2021, donors were raising concerns about the response by international organizations, taking the rare step of sending a letter to UNHCR to express frustration over a lack of leadership and failing to act on prior donor warnings about gaps and delays in providing aid. 1. They cited a range of concerns for newly arriving refugees in Sudan, including risks of trafficking, armed recruitment, and sexual violence. The new Humanitarian Africa correspondent and editor Philip Kleinfeld's exclusive reporting on the matter cited senior aid officials in the camps as decrying a response that was the worst they had seen in their careers.
Some of the concerns related to hasty efforts to find suitable sites for camps, a common struggle in any emergency displacement setting. The sites of Sudan's more recently established camps, particularly Rakuba and Tunaidba, are prone to weather risks, including severe storms, flooding, windstorms, and other hazards. A Médecins Sans Frontières (MSF) report highlights that one camp was built on black cotton soil that is hard and cracks during the dry season and becomes wet, sticky, and muddy during the rainy season. Many have chosen to seek a life elsewhere, rather than languish in camps. One refugee, discussing others he knew who left for Libya, stated, "They know the danger. I tried to tell them many times, but we cannot blame them. Look at this place, they go out of pure despair. Indeed, many risk the dangers of smugglers and traffickers who are well known to eastern Sudan, and profit heavily from desperate migrants and refugees trying to get to northern Africa and Europe." Reports indicate a threefold increase in smuggling since the start of the war. Eritrean refugees and others smuggled and trafficked have long been subjected to rape, torture, extortion, enslavement and detention, and in recent years reports of kidnapping refugees and trafficking them have been reported by the UN and rights groups. And among those that do reach northern Africa, many die trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea in attempts to get to Europe. Some of those who are smuggled or trafficked, including Eritrean refugees, are children who were separated during the conflict. Many still do not know what has happened to family members they lost during the fighting. While aid agencies have conducted family reunification where possible, unaccompanied minors are particularly vulnerable to trafficking and smuggling. Indeed, the trafficking route from eastern Sudan to northern Africa is a common and dangerous pathway for sub-Saharan Africans trying to reach Europe. In short, Isayas Afewerki is assassinating his citizens at home and following them in neighboring Tigray. He is the cruel dictator and killer in the 21st century. Supporting the deadly battle in Ukrainian-Russian war is the clear indication of his evil-mindedness and acts. The world has to investigate the senior dictator Isayas and the fresh dictator and butcher Abiy Ahmed Ali, before they finish the people in East Africa. War in Tigray takes a toll on children. Medical professionals who spoke with Deutsche Welle (DW) reporter in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray state, say the war in Tigray has taken a toll on children. Quoting medical professionals and eyewitnesses, the news portal reported that since the onset of the war in Tigray in November 2020, children have suffered physical, sexual and psychological traumas. Medical professionals at Ida Referral Hospital in Mekelle said 139 children from Mekelle and its environs alone have come to the hospital seeking treatment for injuries sustained by weapons in the last 16 months of the war. Of these, 11 children have died. Additional 39 children were permanently disabled. Furthermore, countless children are currently at risk of starvation, are exposed to lack of vaccines and other medicines, while others are separated from their parents or guardians. On the 11th of June last year, Henrietta Fore, UNICEF's executive director, warned that without humanitarian access to scale up our response, an estimated 33,000 severely malnourished children in currently inaccessible areas in Tigray are at high risk of death. James Elder, another official at UNICEF, said more young children and babies slide dangerously close to sickness and potential death from malnutrition. UNICEF is working with our partners to provide nutrition, healthcare and clean water support. The world cannot permit that to happen. According to the latest humanitarian update from the UN, nutrition supplies for the treatment of severe acute malnutrition among young children were airlifted to Tigray, for the first time since mid-December. However, no food distribution was reported between 17 and the 23rd of February, as food and fuel in the region is almost entirely exhausted. During the reporting week, humanitarian organizations airlifted 47 mt of medical and nutrition supplies to Mekelle, Tigray, bringing the total supplies airlifted since the 24th of January to 144 mt. The supplies this week included 10 MT of nutritional supplies, ready-to-use therapeutic food (RUTF), the first time entering Tigray since mid-December, and will be distributed in Mekelle, eastern and southeastern zones to treat severe acute malnutrition among children under 5, the UN said. The UN warned that as of the 2nd of March, food partners reported they have less than 600 liters of fuel available, excluding contingency stock, and only around 800 MT of food commodities within Tigray.
There is a path to peace in Tigray. Ethiopia can end its civil war by upholding its constitution. By Amhara Eritreans, a professor and academic coordinator at the European University Institute's School of Transnational Governance. In the eyes of the people of Tigray, there is a clear route to peace, but it will require tough decisions, starting with a willingness to accede to the people's most essential demands. The suffering of the people of Tigray and neighboring regions is well documented. This war is now strangling the region with what the United Nations calls a de facto blockade, a UN euphemism for a brutal siege that prevents food aid and medicine from getting to those people, including children, who need it the most. With 5.2 million out of 6 million people in desperate need of food aid, nearly 83% are food insecure, 40% are facing extreme lack of food, and 900,000 live in a famine-like situation. The death toll from this famine, used as a weapon of war, could exceed thousands. Banking and communication services have been shut down. Medicine and other medical supplies are scarce, even for patients needing critical care. Nor are Tigrayans outside Tigray spared Ethiopian state-led attacks. They face widespread discrimination, persistent threats, and mass incarceration. While some have been released from detention, many, including former peacekeepers and military personnel, are still being held incommunicado. Tens of thousands are in refugee camps in Sudan and other countries, and more than 1.8 million are internally displaced and living in makeshift shelters. You can support foreign policy by becoming a subscriber. Subscribe today. Tigray wants, first and foremost, an immediate end to the siege. It wants humanitarian aid to reach the vulnerable people dealing with the horrors of this war. Public services such as transport, electricity, telecommunications, and banking, as well as deliveries of fuel and other items, are indispensable for survival. As a matter of urgency, authorities need to facilitate humanitarian access to all areas of Tigray where there is a need to deliver humanitarian assistance. Mediation should begin now with a humanitarian commitment to a cessation of hostilities by all warring parties to save lives. Once the humanitarian blockade is resolved, attention can then return to the matter at the heart of the conflict. In the past few years, particularly the last 15 months, Tigrayans have confirmed that Ethiopian and Eritrean armies, as well as Amhara regional forces, are waging a genocidal war against communities demanding greater self-rule.
As the war began, the narrative that dominated foreign news outlets was Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's claim that the war was declared in response to Tigrayan forces attacking a federal military post in Tigray on the night of November 4, 2020. Tigrayan authorities, on the other hand, present it as preemptive or anticipatory self-defense to the military buildup that was reportedly going on around the state. While the trigger of the war remains a subject of much debate, the drums of war were banging loudly 2.5 years earlier. Commentators had also clearly forewarned that war was imminent. Prior to November 2020, a massive Ethiopian and Eritrean military deployment was reported in areas surrounding Tigray state. The war drew closer with Tigray's decision to conduct its regional elections and when the federal government slashed the budgetary allocation to Tigray. Central to the conflict is the current populist nationalism with imperial ambitions that relies on ethnic majoritarianism to monopolize power by whatever means available. Central to the conflict is the current populist nationalism with imperial ambitions that relies on ethnic majoritarianism to monopolize power by whatever means available. When convenient, populist nationalism and ethnic majoritarianism invoke constitutional norms such as elections and referendums. When necessary, they use unconstitutional, brutal, and oppressive means, including war on those who resist. Tigrayans view the federal government as an enemy that sided with ethnic Amharas, who claim and currently occupy western and southern Tigray. Even more deplorable, the federal government worked with Eritrea's dictatorship against its own people, a regime that longed for revenge on Tigrayans, particularly the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF), an arch-foe of Eritrean President Isayas Afewerki, and to take over disputed areas that were under the control of Tigrayan authorities, particularly Badme and Ayab. The 1995 Ethiopian constitution has proved incapable of safeguarding communities from ethnic majoritarianism, populist nationalism, and invasion by the Eritrean army. Repeated pleas from the government of Tigray, including a memorandum in May 2020, to the Pan-African and international communities to help prevent the war were ignored. Tigrayans learned the disappointing truth that no Ethiopian federal system, no Pan-African mechanism, and not even the international community will save Tigray from atrocities. Its populace was left to fend for itself while dealing with the massive military, diplomatic, and economic wars imposed on it by both internal and external forces. And so, the war on Tigray gave birth to a resistance that turned civilians into combatants. Many young Tigrayans rallied around the resistance and flocked to the battlefront to join the Tigray Defense Forces (TDF). With an experienced military leadership and its tight command, control, and communication, the TDF came within 100 miles of the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. For Tigrayans, security is a survival issue, and the TDF is the sole guarantor of their security. Many Tigrayans believe the TDF halted the atrocities inflicted on them and will ensure they do not recur. It is highly unlikely that the people of Tigray will accept security provided by any force other than the TDF. To put it plainly, any agreement for peace must keep TDF troops as the main force in Tigray in an internationally guaranteed security agreement. Needless to say, Ethiopia and Eritrea still view the TDF as a grave threat to their national security. The Ethiopian government wants the TDF disarmed or militarily defeated. But Tigray will refuse and resist. To address the concerns and aspirations of all sides, the warring parties need to declare a joint cessation of hostilities and agree on a transitional security arrangement where the TDF is charged with maintaining peace and security in Tigray. Such a transitional security arrangement could coordinate the provision of security, facilitate humanitarian aid, and fast-track the return of displaced people both within the country and outside it.
It would also enable warring parties to begin a negotiated political agreement on a transitional process in Ethiopia, including a nationwide comprehensive and verifiable permanent ceasefire, and preparations for a referendum on the future of Tigray as per Article 39 of the 1995 Constitution. For Tigrayans, security is a survival issue, and the TDF is the sole guarantor of their security. For the TDF to take over the security of Tigray, all external forces must leave the region. The Eritrean army has annexed some territories in Tigray with the approval of the Ethiopian federal government, despite promises for its total withdrawal. Similarly, Amhara forces should return to their deployment lines before the war. A withdrawal from some areas, particularly western Tigray, will not be popular in some parts of the Amhara region or for the Eritrean regime. The Eritrean, Ethiopian, and Amhara forces all consider western Tigray the military chokehold in Tigray's containment. The Eritrean and Ethiopian governments believe that withdrawing from these western territories will enable the TDF to gain access to external assistance, including military and other supplies through Sudan. However, these forces' continued presence in Tigray could lead to the resumption of fighting at the slightest provocation. Any aggression is likely to degenerate into a dangerous waiting game with protracted direct and proxy wars in border areas. In such an event, the popular will to fight, cohesive military and political leadership, resources, and numbers will eventually determine the winner. Ethiopia's current woes are the result of political gridlock, and the country is desperately in need of a genuine political resolution. Spilling over into all corners of the country, this war, like the wars before it, is rooted in the nature of the Ethiopian state. Since its formation as a centralized nation-state, Ethiopia has faced a war of visions about its future. Embodied in the current constitution is a vision of a loose multinational federalism made up of confederative elements where power rests in the hands of constituent units, not the center. Article 8 of the 1995 Constitution states that the constituent units are its nations, nationalities and peoples. In the same vein, Article 39 of the Constitution stipulates diverse cultural communities of Ethiopia bear the unconditional right to self-determination, including the right to secession. Ethiopian multinational federalism is a vision that demands not only greater devolution of power and more autonomy but also genuine self-rule and shared rule, confederal arrangements, self-determination, and even, where necessary, independence. As seen with the Tigrayan popular forces and resistance from the Oromos and others, this vision is entangled with a war of survival, for self-determination and self-rule, in defense against a predatory state. Historically, Ethiopia has mismanaged popular resistance wars, as seen in the 1961–1991 Eritrean War of Independence, which caused the fragmentation of the Ethiopian state leading to the secession of Eritrea.
Internal boundary disputes are not new to Ethiopia. In the past, they have caused violent conflicts in the Somali, Afar, Oromia, and Benishangul Gumuz regional states. However, the mismanagement of today's border issues with Tigray will set a more dangerous precedent and chart a quick path to the disintegration of the country. Currently, most parts of Tigray are outside the military and administrative control of the federal government. Similarly, in some parts of Oromia, Benishangul Gumuz, and areas bordering Sudan and Eritrea, the federal government exercises very limited administrative control. The Eritrean Defense Forces, Ethiopian National Defense Force, TDF, Oromo Liberation Army, and other armed groups operate in different parts of the country. With all the promises and discontent it evokes, Ethiopia's 1995 constitution remains the only instrument that holds Ethiopia together. Only this supreme law can be used to redraw disputed internal or external boundaries, and a forcible takeover of Tigrayan areas in Tigray's west, northwest, and south zones, including Humera, Segede, Cherlemt, and Raya Kobo, by Amhara forces would defeat both its object and purpose. Such a forceful takeover of areas not provided for in the current constitutionally decreed boundaries would likely spark counterhistorical claims to territory and never-ending bad blood. With the pre-war status quo restored, Tigray has the constitutional right and duty to administer the areas, and disputes should be resolved through the existing constitutional mechanisms. Unfortunately, there is little trust in Ethiopian institutions' ability to provide an impartial and objective process to resolve the war on Tigray and other parts of the country. The dominant public view in Tigray is that the federal institutions are part of the war waged on the region and thus cannot be trusted. Until some level of trust is restored, it is unlikely that Tigray will cooperate fully with federal-led initiatives for dialogue and accountability. Victim-centered independent inquiries such as the UN's International Commission of Human Rights experts and other legal mechanisms should be prioritized, irrespective of political dividends and considerations. The governments of Ethiopia, Tigray, and other actors need to facilitate African and international fact-finding and adjudicative bodies' access to areas where atrocities were committed. Neither of the armed parties can win the war. The government could not overrun armed resistance in various areas, including Tigray, and at the same time the TDF and other armed groups in Oromia, thus far, have found it difficult to depose the government. The only way out of the current calamity is negotiations and mediation under a third-party facilitator with state-sanctioned leverage over both parties, such as the United States with the help of African leaders and international guarantors.
To prepare the ground for such substantive and complicated political negotiations, it might be necessary to conclude a framework agreement by all political forces that supplements the current constitution and prepares the ground for a referendum for Tigray, and genuine competitive elections in other parts of the country. This framework agreement needs to provide for a ceasefire among the armed groups and coexistence among Ethiopia's diverse peoples. For this to happen, first the international community needs to provide a credible mechanism for an immediate and verifiable removal of the Eritrean military from Ethiopia, and Amhara forces from Tigray. In addition, the return of people displaced within Tigray and refugees to their areas, and access to and restitution of their homes, land, business, and property will play a critical part in facilitating reconciliation. Without reparations to victims, and the perpetrators of egregious crimes being held accountable, there can be no healing and thus no sustainable peace. Mahari Tadele Maru is a professor and academic coordinator at the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. He is a scholar of peace and security, law and governance, strategy and management, human rights, and migration issues. This is not the opinion of T-Tube. It is the opinion of the writer. T-Tube argues the invaders and genocidal criminals should have to be liable of their crimes against humanity and treason. The outsiders who invaded Tigray should also be liable of their crimes committed on the innocent people of Tigray.